Geopolitics and Empire welcomes back renowned Swiss historian, best-selling author, and founder and director of the Swiss Institute for Peace and Energy Research in Basel, Daniele Ganser. Welcome back to Geopolitics and Empire, Daniele.
Thanks a lot, Harvey, for inviting me.
Yeah, we spoke many years ago when I Skyped you into my class at the Tecnológico de Monterrey, the only university in all of Latin America that is invited to Davos and officially, I think, a World Economic Forum partner. And, one of your early groundbreaking books we discussed dealt with NATO state terrorism, as I call it, and Operation Gladio. And I'm happy to see that you have new books in English. I've got the new one right here, USA, The Ruthless Empire from Skyhorse. And honestly, if I were still teaching international relations, I'm not kidding, this would have been a signed reading for my students. It literally covers everything I taught on U.S. foreign policy. And maybe if you want to tell us, just start with the book, how you came about writing it and why you wrote USA Ruthless Empire.
The idea really was to give somebody who doesn't know much about U.S. imperialism at all an overview. So I really start with Christopher Columbus with the Europeans going over the Atlantic and then fighting in North America, and then the Declaration of Independence, and then how they grabbed the colonies from the Spanish in 1898. When in Cuba the Maine exploded, and they said the Spanish are responsible, although they were not responsible. And then the Americans take over Cuba, they take over the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, and that's really in 1898 when U.S. imperialism starts, I think. And then in the role played in World War I, the role played in World War II, including the Pearl Harbor history, is in it. And then the biggest part of the book really is on the period after World War II, because that's really the important data that we have to look at today. I mean, the US is the most powerful country of the world in terms of military technology. It has the biggest defense budget, $880 billion per year. That's just insane. That's a figure that has to be repeated. It's $880 billion a year. And China has around 300, Russia has around 80. So just to give you the correlations. So the book then goes into the creation of the CIA and how in Iran the Mossadegh government was overthrown, and in Guatemala Arbenz was overthrown. I go into the Vietnam War, and I go into Iran-Contra scandals. I really, it's a chronological order to until 9/11, terrorist attacks, World Trade Center 7, Iraq War, Syria War, and actually, and that's something I had to add at the end, until the Russian invasion of Ukraine on 24th of February 2022. So covers a lot of territory, so to speak.
Yeah, and it's almost like, from my perspective, basically everything is like a false flag operation. From the very beginning, as you detail, from the U.S.-Mexico wars, what was done to the Native Americans, and then on and on. They just use this technique nonstop. And again, I highly recommend people get the digital or the physical copy of the book. And you mentioned empire, and I think empire in general. And as you mentioned in the book, American empire in our time, the new Rome, as you cite in the book, seems to be one of the core reasons for many of the ills facing mankind in the past, but also today. And, that's what you discuss in your first chapter. This is a hard pill, I think, for many Americans and Western Europeans to swallow. But I do think slowly the tide is turning as multipolarity it comes about and more people become critical and confident in criticizing the U.S. empire. Where do you feel the empire is at right now? And then that can then lead us into your thoughts on the rise of China, Belt and Road, which you discussed at the end of your book, BRICS and multipolarity.
Throughout history, empires have risen and fallen. Some of the most successful empires were those that offered people a reason to come, often lower taxes and the prospect of citizenship. In ancient times, empires would say foreigners can become one of us and prosper through business and trade. Throughout history, people have gravitated to jurisdictions that have given them the best conditions to do business. So if you run a business, you should consider nomad capitalists because they help entrepreneurs and investors relocate to parts of the world where they can keep more of their wealth. They literally wrote the book on it, The Best-Selling Nomad Capitalist. Find it on Amazon. If you're an entrepreneur or investor and believe you're paying too much in tax, or if you'd like to get a second passport or a third passport like I have, to expand your options and not have to be reliant on one government, there are legal ways to do this. Nomad Capitalist has been assisting over 1,000 clients for the last 10 years. You can check out their 2,000 plus educational YouTube videos and nearly 2,000 blogs. Just go to nomadcapitalist.com, learn how they can help you legally reduce your tax bill, expand your options globally, and navigate the algorithm ghetto.
Well, I fully agree with you that it's a bitter pill to swallow for people in the West. I'm based here in Switzerland, so that's part of the West. All countries that surround Switzerland, which is Germany in the north, Italy in the south, France in the west, and Austria in the east, are in the West. So I'm deeply embedded in the Western culture. The US and Canada obviously are the West, and we have to just realize that we're 1 billion out of 8 billion people in the world. The West is 1 billion, so there's another 7: India, China, the countries of Africa, etc. And the West has traditionally thought of itself with a lot of high esteem, in the sense that what we do is good, and if the others disagree, they just don't understand. And there has been a discussion in historical circles in the West about British imperialism. The British, controlled India for a time, as you know, Australia for a time, as you know, parts of Africa. The French controlled parts of Africa for a time, and Vietnam and other parts in Southeast Asia. And that has been criticized. It's now standard narrative to say French imperialism is wrong, British imperialism is wrong. But it's a long, long time ago, and people try to think that U.S. imperialism does not exist. That imperialism ended. It's sort of vanished. It's not here anymore. When the British left Hong Kong or so. And in the book, I try to say that it is an empire, that the US is an empire, very much like the British were an empire or the Dutch were an empire when they colonized Indonesia, or when the French controlled Algeria. But still, this narrative is difficult. And so in the beginning of the book, I very specifically say that there are 330 million people in the US. And when I criticize US imperialism, I do not criticize 330 million people. I don't. Because I've traveled in the US and I've met wonderful people, really, in many places. I was in Washington State, I was in Washington, D.C., I was in New York, I was in Florida, I was in California, and I've met wonderful people. But the criticism that I offer in this book is really regarding the U.S. wars. I criticize, for instance, the attack on Vietnam. I say it's absolutely unnecessary that the U.S. bombed Vietnam from 1964 to 1975. Killed more than 3 million people, so it's not a small thing. And I say the victims are, on the one hand, the Vietnamese that were killed there, but on the other hand, also U.S. soldiers who were lied to, by their own government. The government of President Johnson, that was in 1964, said, we were attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin, and as you said, it was a false flag narrative. There was no attack on the Maddox. There wasn't. So the start of the Vietnam War in August 1964, and I have it in the book, it's just based on lies, and all these American soldiers who got shot there, or traumatized, or lost an arm, lost a leg, lost hope, lost their inner peace. There are victims as well. So I specifically say I'm critical of the American elite, which is less than 1% of the population. They wage all these wars, and It remains a difficult topic. It remains a difficult topic. Also here in Europe, it's hard to talk about U.S. imperialism. Some people say it doesn't exist. There's no U.S. imperialism. Then I say, wait a moment. Do the Germans have military bases in the U.S.? No, it's the U.S. which has many military bases in Germany. Do the Italians have military bases in the U.S.? No, it's the Americans who have military bases in Italy. Do the Japanese have military bases in the US? No, it's the US who has military bases in Japan. The Koreans, South Korea, do they have military bases in the US? No, it's the US who has military bases in South Korea. Do the Cubans have military bases in US? No. But US has military base in Cuba, Guantanamo. The Philippines, do they have military base in US? No, it's the other way around. So when you look at it from a historical perspective, and I really appreciate the work you do, and I know you're familiar with all that. But when you look at it from an objective point of view, with all the military bases, then it's a clear-cut fact. The US is at the moment the ruling empire.
Yeah, and especially for Europeans as well. I'm also a Croatian European citizen, and I see the same thing as you do when I go back to Croatia and travel in Europe. It's hard to swallow for Western Europeans because I think in a way we are vassals of the US. The EU was a project, from what I remember, 50% plus financed by the CIA and the State Department. And it almost seems like, I've been thinking about this recently, there's a 1939 plan by a guy called Straits, called Atlantic Union, to sort of integrate Europe with the United States into one sort of transatlantic political system. And we've seen this throughout with the Ukraine war. And again, you mentioned the Tonkin. I love that. This is why I love your book, because it's a broad stroke, big picture of what's going on. And I would assign to my students to read the declassified NSA files. I think it was from the early 2000s on the Tonkin Gulf, or the Operation Ajax from the 30-page actual CIA plan of Ajax. I mean, this is what professors should be doing. And then maybe what are your thoughts then on the rise of China, and then what we're seeing in Europe with Ukraine? I think a lot of us understand kind of what's going on here. NATO expanding, wanting to dominate globally. They see threats in the rise of China and the world island and Eurasia. You mentioned Seymour Hersh in your book often, and we've seen him lately reporting, for example, on false flags such as Nord Stream. And so what are your sort of thoughts as to where we are and what's going on with China, Russia, and Ukraine?
Well, that's obviously the crucial topic right now that everybody's talking about, Ukraine. I mean, the Russian invasion of 24 February 2022 was clearly illegal. So, you can't invade in another country. Very much like the US invasion of Afghanistan was illegal. You just can't invade another country. You can't do it. But, and that's an important point, it was not unprovoked, because that's what Western media always say. It was unprovoked and illegal. No, it was illegal, but it was not unprovoked. And what was the provoking thing? It was really the expansion of NATO. So I do a lot of talks in Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. And the main thing in Germany is that Germany was a divided country. I know that you know that, and I know it. And, some people in the audience who might be 15 or 20 years old maybe don't remember. Germany, like North Korea and South Korea today, was in the Cold War divided into countries. So it was Eastern Germany and Western Germany. And the DDR, the Eastern Germany, was occupied by Soviet forces. And then at the end of 1990, the Germans and the Russians, or the Soviets, talked together, and then the Soviets withdrew all their troops, 500,000 troops. That was Gorbachev, who was the last president of the Soviet Union. And then the Soviet Union in 1991 collapsed into 15 different states, and Ukraine being one of them, Russia and Kazakhstan, etc. And the important point is that at that time, the NATO and the Americans promised to the Russians that they would not expand NATO further to the east. And they kept that promise for 9 years. And in 1999, Bill Clinton, US President Bill Clinton, first of all, bombed Serbia, which was again illegal. And he expanded NATO. He took in Poland, he took in Hungary and the Czech Republic. And it was just, from a Russian perspective, it was like, no way. Now the US is expanding its military alliance, because you said very correctly that the Europeans are in a sort of vassals. I mean, they tend to think that they're independent. They tend to say, no, we're free. And of course, we're not, subordinate to the US. But I mean, look at Germany. I mean, Germany is said to be the strongest country in Europe. And certainly from an economic point of view, it is. But if you look at it, it's basically occupied by the US. The US has military bases all over Germany, Ramstein being the biggest one. And so you have this expansion of NATO. In 2004, we have Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, who come into NATO, and it just step by step grows. So Ukraine is the topic everybody's talking about, but when we can talk about this topic as well, we first of all have to say, well, my perspective is yes, the Russian invasion of Vladimir Putin is illegal. But NATO expansion was the key reason why we came to this catastrophic situation that we are now in. And this NATO expansion was then reaching a higher level when in 2014, US President Obama overthrew the government in Ukraine. That not many people know that. Many people think, no, Obama, he's received the Nobel Peace Prize. He's going to be a good guy. But he bombed Libya. 2011. He bombed Syria, 2014. And in 2014, he overthrew the government in Kiev. And that was Victoria Nuland who was in charge, under Secretary of State. And she was, making a phone call with then US Ambassador in Kiev, Jeffrey Pyatt. And this phone call was intercepted. We don't know who intercepted it. It was top secret. But the data is now available for historians. And the data clearly shows that she says the new government should be Yatsenyuk. And he's the new guy who becomes prime minister. And he doesn't become prime minister through an election. There are snipers on the roofs in Kiev who shoot both demonstrators and police. So, that's classic strategy of tension technique, and it's a coup d'etat. So I'm saying, yes, the Russian invasion is illegal, but also the US coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014, so 8 years before the invasion, was also illegal. And the government in Kiev has carried out a civil war for 8 years, killing 14,000 people. Nobody cared, We had Corona, we had different issues. We were talking about many things, but we were not talking about Ukraine. And it's only when the Russian invaded that, Western media here in Switzerland or in Germany, in Great Britain, in France, started really to count the people who are dying in Ukraine, and it's terrible. I do have to say it's terrible to see war in Europe, but I think it's totally hypocritical that you only start to count the deaths after the Russians invaded. Why don't you count the deaths after the coup d'état of the Americans? And why don't you basically talk about the coup? And this is something that we can do here on your YouTube channel or on my YouTube channel, but the bigger television networks, they don't talk about the coup d'état. And this brings me to the BRICS. This movement of NATO, first expansion, then the overthrow of the government in Ukraine, and also the invitation to Ukraine to become a NATO member. This has really angered Russia. And so Russia and India have become much, much, much closer. And Russia and China have become much, much, much closer. Russia and Brazil have become much closer, and Russia and South Africa. So this whole BRICS structure has really become a network which now leads to a multipolar world. I mean, I'm totally convinced that the multipolar world is in the making, in front of our very eyes, and the West has to read Russian texts. We have to read Chinese text. We have to read Indian text. We have to read text from Brazil. We have to read text from South Africa. Otherwise, we don't understand it. If we just read English, American, French, German, Swiss, and Italian text, we're basically moving in the NATO story world. And that's just 1 billion people. It's not everybody.
Yeah, that's what I try to do on my socials, is share information from all sources, directly from Russian government and Chinese government sources. And I actually had the privilege of shaking hands with the last president of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, 6 years ago when I was in.
Oh, you met him personally?
Yeah, okay. I was on a tour with Sharon Tennyson of Center for Citizens Initiatives. We went on a tour. We met Vladimir Pozner, the famous Russian media figure, had 2 hours with Gorbachev. Actually, Gorbachev was awarded an honorary doctorate at my alma mater, the Geneva School of Diplomacy. He was supposed to come to my graduation in 2009, but he couldn't for medical reasons. His right-hand man and translator came, but I caught up with him in Moscow many years later, and on this program, I've had. By the way, you mentioned Syria. Just this morning, I'm reading there are illegal troops, U.S. troops in Syria, and I recall a few months ago, someone asked the UN about those troops, and the UN's like, no, there's no U.S. Presence in Syria, and they just killed a Syrian civilian today. They're taking 80% of Syrian oil, and I've had the former British ambassador to Syria, Peter Ford, on the program as well some years ago. But I've talked to people like Thierry Meyssan of Voltaire Network, Guy Matan.
Yeah, he knows the story.
Yeah, and Guy Matan, the Swiss journalist, and just on Ukraine, their conclusion is that one result of what's going on with Ukraine is the deindustrialization and collapse of Europe, and they're positing that the West, Washington, kind of wants this. They kind of want to weaken Europe, and it's great what you laid out on multipolarity, but my fear is just your further thoughts on where this Ukraine war could go, its effect on Europe, and then the potential for it to escalate to like a third world war.
I mean, I certainly see the point that the US does not want Europe to prosper economically. I mean, Germany, on the ranking of the big, we have 193 nations on that globe. And the US and China are, let's say, 1 and 2. I'm not saying which one is the biggest economy because it's a huge debate, but, China has made a huge step forward. And let's still say US is on 1 and China is on 2, but this is about to switch. And on the third space, there's Japan, and on the fourth is already Germany. Okay, so that's something very important. That's Germany is the fourth biggest economic power, and you rightly say that the U.S. elite. Again, I'm not talking about U.S. population. I'm talking about the U.S. elite, which is running foreign policy, like the neocons and people who want a new American century, etc. And they say that when Germany gets cheap gas from Russia, and they did, get cheap gas from Russia for a long time, then Germany is going to, as an industrialized state, it's going to be stronger and stronger and stronger. So on the 26th of September in 2022, the Nord Stream pipelines were taken out by a terrorist attack. And I fully go with Seymour Hersh's analysis, who says this was an attack carried out on the orders of US President Joe Biden. So I think Joe Biden has destroyed Nord Stream. And if that is a fact, by the way, Seymour Hersh says Victoria Nuland was also involved. So that's interesting. Victoria Nuland is the lady who overthrew the government in Kiev and who takes out Nord Stream. So she's created quite a bit of chaos here in Europe, but nobody talks about her. You ask somebody in Switzerland, who is Victoria Nuland? They go like, I don't know. They only know Joe Biden. They know Joe Biden, he's the president, but they don't know the details. They don't know that there's an agenda to actually destroy the cooperation between Russia and Germany. George Friedman from Stratford, he once said it in 2015. He gave a talk. I think it was in Chicago. I'm not sure, but I think it was in Chicago. George Friedman talk where he said, we basically have to see to it that Russia and Germany are not working together as close partners because otherwise they get too strong. And he says U.S. policy has always been basically to destroy that cooperation. And the explosion of Nord Stream is really, to me, the most obvious. I mean, everybody has to agree that Nord Stream was blown up. And when we look at the work of Seymour Hersh, we have to give him the credit that he's the sort of guy who has very high-placed sources in the Pentagon and in the CIA. He never, ever gives out the names of these guys, but I think he just got it right. And Joe Biden at the time, in February 2022, said, we will take out Nord Stream. He said it, we don't want this cooperation. We have the means to do it. And as you said, Germany is now paying a hefty price for that. I mean, German economy is in serious trouble for many different reasons. I mean, they put all their money into the Ukraine war, sent over their Leopard tanks, and the Russians destroy them over there. And the German government it's really not doing what the German population wants, because there's been a There's been a poll recently, and 55% of the population said we want peace talks. We don't want war with Russia, because the German population, they still remember Operation Barbarossa when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, and they still remember that in the end, the Soviets then, arrived in Berlin. So they say we don't want that anymore. Let's have peace in Ukraine. Even, if you have to make concession and say, okay, then the Crimea goes to Russia, or parts of the eastern part of Ukraine go to Russia. So that's the feeling in Germany, but the government doesn't respect that at all. And I have talks in Germany, many talks actually, in Munich, in Dortmund, in Hanover, in the big cities. And it's very difficult for me to say, first of all, your nation is not a sovereign nation. You're under, you suffer from limited sovereignty because the Americans have military bases here. Secondly, the Americans blew up Nord Stream, and you don't even have the guts to say that's not right. The German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, he didn't say anything, nothing. And third, by arming Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, you're being dragged into a war with Russia, and that's not actually a good idea for Germany. The Germans train Ukrainian soldiers on German soil, and they always pretend, no, we're not at war. Yes, we send weapons. No, but we're not at war. Yes, we train Ukrainian soldiers, but we're not at war. So it's really complete denial. It's not a systematic analysis of international politics.
Yeah, and just on Nord Stream, often my guests predict the future here, and I had on, I think in October of 2022, Vietnam veteran Bob Moriarty, who listens to the program. Shout out to Bob, and he posited that it was the CIA fingerprints behind Nord Stream, and then later, as you say, you see more Hirsch's analysis, and others are kind of confirming that, and we're seeing more of that stuff, like the Kerch Bridge recently, the dam being exploded, and it just continues. And
it just continues. It's a fight on infrastructure, and Bill Burns, who's now the CIA director, he was actually the U.S. ambassador in Moscow in 2008, at the time when George Bush invited Ukraine to become a NATO member, which is foolish. And Bill Burns, to his credit, at the time wrote the memorandum and said we shouldn't invite Ukraine into NATO. This will lead to civil war. Okay, he said "niet" means "niet." And that was classified. But thanks to Julian Assange, who should be freed, by the way, Julian Assange should be freed. He's still in prison in London. But thanks to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, we have that memorandum from Bill Burns. So I think Bill Burns, the now acting director of the CIA, is a guy who fully understands how the whole thing developed. He even warned of it. But according to Seymour Hersh, he was involved together with Victoria Nuland and Jake Sullivan in the terrorist attack on Nord Stream. So it really is interesting to see that Germany is now, in a sense, also at war with the US. Because when you have 31 NATO countries, and the idea in NATO is that you don't attack each other, okay, and then the US blows up the infrastructure of Germany, and the Norwegians help, well, then that's two NATO countries against another NATO countries. Crazy, absolutely crazy. This should be headline news, but people talk about football here. They don't talk about that. It's too delicate.
And that's why I call it the North Atlantic Terrorist Organization, and because of the work you've done on Gladio and others, and just on that note regarding NATO, it just continues to expand. Finland and Sweden, and they want to take in Ukraine, and then Georgia again. They want to create an Asian NATO. They're opening offices in Japan. They want to give nukes to South Korea, and nuclear subs to Australia. It's like they're preparing for war with China, and like they're creating a world imperial army controlled by Washington, London, and Brussels. And then couple that with the regime change operations, we continue to see color revolutions, which my thesis was written on. And like in Kazakhstan, they tried it last year. In Pakistan, they took out Imran Khan. Bolivia, Peru. here in Mexico, my president AMLO just sent a letter to Biden openly, like a week or two ago, saying, "Tell USAID to stop financing the Mexican opposition." And so, just your thoughts on this continued expansion of NATO and these regime change operations that we continue to see.
I think it's a bit of an overstretch. Imperial overstretch is when you try. I mean, 193 countries is a lot of countries, right? And if you try, to pick a fight with all of them, you will obviously have a problem. And I think the US is in this phase of imperial overstretch. I mean, the Trump administration tried to overthrow the government of Chavez in Venezuela. They didn't succeed. The Obama administration tried to overthrow in Syria the government of Assad, President Assad. They didn't succeed. I mean, they stirred up unrest. They armed radical Muslims, and the idea was to get rid of Assad. And it was actually already then. People often forget the Syrian civil war, which was obviously not a civil war; it was an international war. But the conflict in Syria was the first moment when Putin said, "It's enough," because basically Assad called Putin and said, "The Americans are trying to overthrow me here. Can you help me?" And then Putin went in and bombed all these radical Muslims that had been armed by the MI6 and the CIA. And so Assad is still in power. And if we move on that topic of regime change, it looks to me as if the Americans, I mean, I don't have definite proof, but it looks to me that they also try to overthrow Erdogan, the president in Turkey. I'm not sure. Do you have like solid facts on that one?
No, but I'd agree with you. It seems like they tried in 2016 and failed.
Yeah. I mean, the 2016 attempt was certainly an attempt to overthrow the government. I mean, that's proven, but it's still, to me, it's still a little bit unclear whether the US were behind it, but it looks like it. But, as a historian, I have to be cautious where I'm sure and where I'm speculating. And there on the Turkey issue, I'm speculating, but Erdogan certainly is convinced the Americans tried to overthrow him. And that leads him to flirt with the BRICS. He's a NATO country. I mean, Turkey is a NATO country, and Turkey does not take part in the economic sanctions, in the economic war against Russia. They just don't do it. And also Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia is another one of these countries which is not anymore under total control of the US. It wasn't a very, very strong control of the US after the Second World War. There were very strong relationships between Washington and Riyadh. But now, as you can see, the Saudis sell part of their oil not anymore in dollar, but they sell it in yuan, and they sell it to the Chinese. And they say, the US, you have nothing, you actually don't have to dictate our foreign policy. And so your question is what do I think about all these regime changes? Well, first of all, I think they are illegal. And secondly, I think it has come to a point where they backfire. There are many, publications on blowback where you actually do something and do it again and again and again. And in the end, it backfires and you have negative results. And I think we are in this situation because the coup in Ukraine 2014, as I said before, and I write it in my book, I say it's a coup by the US, not by the people, again, not by the people in the US, wonderful people, but by the US government and the elite. And it really backfires now because at the beginning it looked promising, they could install a new government, and then this new government, was buying a lot of weapons from Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and Boeing. So weapon sales went up, and BlackRock and Vanguard and all these investment companies were all happy. And so at the first glance, you'd say it worked out. But now you see, with the seizing of Russian assets, a lot of Russian assets were actually confiscated in the West. That has led the Chinese, the Russians, and the Saudis and the Indians to rethink. They say, have you seen what happened with all that money, Russian money, several billions, which was in the US, which was in Switzerland, which was in Germany, which was in England. And the banks just said, oh, this is a bank account from Gazprom. Well, as of now, you cannot access your money. Okay, it's locked. I mean, guess what? The Chinese have seen that. The Russians have seen it. The Indians have seen it. The South Africans have seen it. People in Brazil have seen it. I mean, people on the political level. And they say, we can't trust NATO countries. We just can't trust them anymore. And now, if I go back to global perspective, with 31 members in NATO, 31, because you mentioned Finland has joined. Sweden is not in yet. So it's 31. Finland is number 31. But we have 193 countries. So minus 31, that's 162 countries. That's still a lot of countries. And look at how differently they look at the world. The main problem I see here in Switzerland or also in the US or in Germany is that people, they read The Economist, published in UK. They read the New York Times, published in the US. And then they read the Washington Post, published in the US. Then they read Der Spiegel, which is a German news magazine. Then they read Neue Zürcher Zeitung. And then they watch Austrian television, ORF. And then they think they have an international perspective because they jump from country to country. But they basically move within NATO territory. And as you said before, and rightly so, it is very important to read Chinese data, Russian text, South African text, and Brazilian text, because they really look in the world in a multipolar world, and that's the new thing which is evolving.
I've had a little taste of what you mentioned. In 2021, my Patreon was frozen, terminated, and then last year the Department of Homeland Security banned me from PayPal, together with Consortium News and Minpress News, and so it's kind of freaky what's going on. But I did.
It's information warfare. It's information warfare. They try to silence you by taking away the money.
Yeah, it's interesting. And let me ask you.
So it has to be irrelevant what you say. It has to be irrelevant what you say.
I mean, that's a good sign that they find a little old me, one dude with a microphone, that important to do what they're doing. And I haven't really seen you comment on what's been going on the last couple of years. The whole, I call it COVID 1984. In your book, you discuss America as an oligarchy. I think that's clear. And it seems that the oligarchs are increasingly consolidating power at a global level. And we're seeing this, like a World Economic Forum. We had just recently the Bilderberg meeting in Portugal. Kissinger was there. And, it seems like they still have these plans for global domination. My guest just before you was Richard Gage, who you're familiar with. And, he also thinks that, we had 9/11, and then we had like COVID 9/11, which is like more of the same. And, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. now, who's running for president, he's come out and said that COVID was like a CIA, Department of Defense operation to take control of nations. And I mean, I interviewed in January of 2020 Dr. Francis Boyle, the author of the Bioweapons Act, and that interview blew up and caused us a lot of trouble. And he posited that this was biological warfare. Do you have any thought on what happened with COVID, and then all this talk about World Economic Forum and Great Reset and these digital controls? And because you do talk about digital empire as well in the book.
I do. I'm cautious as far as COVID is. I'm more reluctant. I'm not saying it is this or that. I'm still like, it erupted in 2020 and in 21 and 22. So basically, the Corona years for me is 2020 and 21. Here in Switzerland, we had a lockdown in March 2020, which is really shocking. I was going like, what? The kids are not going to school? What? We're not allowed to shake hands anymore? What? Everybody has to wear masks. So I really thought this was totalitarian, and I didn't expect that. I didn't expect it. And then obviously the World Health Organization is based in Switzerland for one, and the World Economic Forum is gathering in Davos in the Swiss mountains. So it's not that I'm far away from the whole story. I'm pretty close to it, and I've seen all these analysis that it is a CIA operation, to set up a global dictatorship run by the World Health Organization. And so I've seen that. I'm not sure whether I'm convinced. I have to say, it might be, but maybe not. I'm not sure. I'm still in this mood of what was that? What was that? What did they do? Who was involved? Who knew what? And why did they do what they did? As far as Robert Kennedy Jr. is concerned, I would certainly vote for him as a president if I was a U.S. citizen. I'm a Swiss citizen, so I can't vote for him. But I think he's a very honest and courageous guy. Obviously, they smear and attack him where they can, but I advise everybody to really look at Robert Kennedy Jr. on the internet when he speaks. He speaks without any teleprompter. He speaks from the heart. Very, very interesting man. And I know he's highly critical of the corona measures, of basically of limiting civil liberties. And there I'm also very critical. I don't like it at all if somebody tells me you have to stay at home and you cannot invite 10 friends. That's too much. You can have max 2 and all these things. That's my private business. And the government doesn't have to tell me what I have to do. And when the Swiss government came out and said, everybody has to do the vaccination, I didn't do it. I definitely didn't do it. I didn't trust this vaccination, but that's my personal perspective. It's not my perspective as a historian. It's just I don't like it if people attack my liberties, and I don't like it when they say you have to take this vaccine, and I didn't even test it, and they said this vaccine will prevent the spread of the virus. No, it doesn't. we now see it doesn't at all. It will. It has no side effects. Oh yes, it has side effects. Not for everybody, but for some people, it has side effects. So really, the corona story to me is proof that we have to think for ourselves. We cannot just let the government run the show, because the government says we've checked everything and this is the right way, and then they go that way, and afterwards you find out that's the wrong way. And so I'm very critical of all governments, of the German government, of the Swiss government, of the French government, of the Italian government, of the Austrian government, of the US government, of the British government, because they all basically put a lot of pressure on their populations, on their respective populations. And I've never seen that before in my life. I'm now 50 years old. Never seen that.
Yeah, many guests. I had on Mark Faber. I think he's originally from Swiss, investor based in Thailand. He said, in all of history, this is unprecedented what we went through. And like you, I've never taken a PCR test. I have not taken the Pentagon juice, as I call it. And what you said on RFK Jr. I think I only voted once Republican for Ron Paul, who had the great privilege of meeting last weekend in Texas and hanging out with Daniel McAdams from the Ron Paul Institute. And I think I'm going to vote as a Democrat for the first time for RFK Jr. I mean, it's the last time we'll be able to vote probably for a Kennedy. And he's just you can't compare. He blows everyone out of the water, as you said, in terms of what he's talking about, his foundational knowledge about everything. He's talking about COVID. He's saying,
and he speaks. And he speaks without a teleprompter. Take the teleprompter away from President Joe Biden, and then he will be at a loss. Not so Robert Kennedy Jr. He speaks without a teleprompter, and he knows. He has these sentences. He goes like, "The media lie to the U.S. population, and the U.S. population knows it, and they're sick of it." I mean, Joe Biden would never say that. Okay. And so there are a few guys out there, also women who are honest and who try to protect civil liberties. It's very important. Freedom is something which has to be cherished. It has not, if we give it up for some sort of dictatorship, that would be just a huge mistake. Let's fight for our freedoms, definitely. And let's not have these illegal wars all the time. These are the two things that I work on such a lot. I say the data is there. Take Iraq, 2003. There were no weapons of mass destructions. There were none. So it was a lie. Who were the victims? The people in Iraq who were killed. Who is now in prison? Julian Assange. For heaven's sake, he's a journalist. With the video Collateral Murder, he proved that US soldiers in Baghdad fired down from an Apache helicopter on civilians. Why is he in prison? And Tony Blair, Prime Minister of UK, is free. And Bush is free. These guys walk free. They are the guys who are to blame for the invasion. So really, I think that the time is now here that we have take a much more critical approach to which governments do. Crimes in high places is really something that we can observe. And you talked of Richard Gates, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm fully convinced, and I write it in this book, which doesn't make it easier, but I also go into 9/11 because 9/11 led to the war in Afghanistan. And if we ever will understand the war in Afghanistan, 250,000 people killed or more, then we have to go to 9/11. And many people think on 9/11 we only have the Twin Towers, which collapsed, but that's not true. We had a third tower, and that was World Trade Center 7. And it also collapsed like that in 7 seconds, like that. You have to really watch it. For those who have never seen it, World Trade Center 7, it just takes you 10 seconds to watch it. And it just goes against its own footprint, and that's impossible. This is controlled demolition. And if we have controlled demolition on 9/11, we realize that on very important subjects, we have not been told the truth.
Yeah, and you mentioned Assange, and I think we should also mention most recently, who's been a guest on my podcast as well, Kit Klarenberg, the British journalist based in Serbia, writes for the Grey Zone. He recently went back for family visit to UK, was interrogated for 5 hours by the British counter-terrorism officers. So they're implying he's a terrorist for being a journalist. They took all of his electronic devices, his DNA, the swabs, and that sort of leads me to one of my final questions. One of my biggest obsessions, as you just mentioned, yours is the wars and freedom, and I'm greatly concerned with the digital empire, as you call it, or as one of my past guests, Edwin Black, calls it, the algorithm ghetto, because he's a Jewish historian. He compares it to the physical ghetto that the Jews were put in, and that they're building this digital system where they're going to put us into a digital ghetto. And then if you don't comply with whatever the government wants you to comply with, as you mentioned, whether it's vaccines or whatever ideology or the correct perspective on the war in Ukraine, they just shut off your bank accounts. We've seen just this year, Jeremy McKenzie, Canadian military veteran, had his bank accounts shut, and no other bank in Canada will open a bank account for him. A podcaster in Australia, Maria Zaric, just had her bank account shut. And then you talk about the social credit system in China and how that's coming to the West. And that's sort of my biggest fear, because they're trying to remove cash. Daily, I'm on top of this, and you're just seeing them roll out all these digital systems. And then what happens if you can't pay with cash? You can't buy food, you can't work, you can't travel, you can't do anything. Any thoughts on the incoming social credit system?
Yeah, it is a clear and present danger. And I think local communities with decentralized structures who produce their own food, have their own currencies, who stick together, who work together is probably the only answer. I don't see any other strategic option. I mean, these local communities they exist in some parts, but obviously if somebody does not have a bank account or if it is not in the digital world at all, I mean, obviously I'm in Switzerland, you're in Mexico, we profit from the digital world because we can, communicate at very low cost and publish at very low costs. So there's also benefits for it. But this digital revolution is really something which can also lead to mass surveillance and really to have a social credit system which then goes global. I mean, it was set up in China. People had 1,000 points, and when you crossed the road and was a red light, which is illegal, but it's not a huge offense if you compare it to, torturing people in Guantanamo. But, then you cross the road, you lose some points because there are cameras everywhere. And obviously with the cameras, you can identify people automatically. And the algorithms can just, count down your score. And, these things were not possible 40 years ago. It was just technically impossible. And now we have drone warfare in Ukraine. Wake up. These drones have, if you watch it, the Ukrainians use it, the Russians use it, and what you basically have is a soldier with his little gadget there to move the drone, and he steers the drone, which is very low cost, maybe $300, steers it directly into a tank, which is $7 million, and blows it up. Now, if that is possible to do that in Ukraine, you imagine a world where people do all these things. They have their drones, they have the surveillance thing. So it all boils really down to the question of what will happen with all this technology. I mean, we love this technology on the one hand. It has, it has helped us a lot. And on the other hand, we see if we add 20 or 50 years, where are we going to be? I mean, what will this mean for our kids and grandchildren? Will this be the total surveillance state? So what will it be? And I tend to give a spiritual answer, that the human being is in the end, we're not just a body. So we have a spirit. And from this spirit, all the strength has to come. And then we can overcome the problems with the machines. But some people obviously think human beings are just machines. I don't think so. I think we're in essence, we're spirits. And if we connect on that level, on a spiritual level, we can get a lot of strength. Obviously, I see what you're talking about, and I don't want to say it's not a problem. I think it's a challenge. Definitely is a challenge in the 21st century. We have surveillance technology like never before. Edward Snowden told us the whole story, didn't he? And he basically said, this is the end of privacy if we don't pay attention. And then we said, well, Edward Snowden is a funny guy and it's not my problem. And we just continued. But now, looking back, we have to say, okay, maybe it's an important topic that he raised.
Well, yeah, when you have your accounts being shot, Alina Lipp, the German journalist, had her bank account shot, and then her parents' bank accounts shot who had nothing to do with anything. And let me ask about the collapse of American empire, because Ray Dalio, the billionaire whose work I follow, he posts mostly on LinkedIn. He just posted a few days ago. He talks about the cycles of empire, and he was saying that he thinks we're going to see like a second sort of civil war in America. De-dollarization is going on. The insane levels of debt. Do you have any, as we close here, any thought on this, sort of collapse or decline of America? Because you touched on BRICS and multipolarity; they're growing, but and any thought on what might happen to America?
I don't really know. I mean, that's we're the year 2023, and I've been very cautious now on anything that regards predictions. I mean, where will we be in 2030? Will it be worse? Will it be better? I really don't know. I'm very cautious. I do take the facts that we have, what happened, Vietnam War, 9/11, Corona, these things happened. We know it, and we can study these in detail and learn from it. But no, sorry, I couldn't tell you where the US is in 2030, and I couldn't tell you where Switzerland is in 2030, or the European Union in 2050. But what we know and what we all observe as human beings is that we are living through times of transformation. Okay, everything changes quickly. I personally had no idea that there could be something like a global lockdown and people couldn't go to work or to school. That was new to me. And now we have this confrontation in Ukraine where if one nuclear power, which is Russia, and the other nuclear power, which is the US, and each has 6,000 nuclear bombs, they're fighting a proxy war in that country. I mean, I go, oh, Jesus Christ, why do we have that? We don't want that. And then I try to visualize the positive things. I mean, you basically create what you visualize. And when you visualize a dark future, you're going to get a dark future. When you visualize a bright future, you have a chance that you get there. And my vision is that we don't let governments just, get away with all their crimes. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we learn to solve conflicts without violence. It might sound difficult or impossible, but we have the potential as human beings, as spiritual beings. We have the potential, not to kill and not to lie. And we obviously also need media which give us the facts, because many media outlets, they just manipulate us in one story and then the next story. I mean, how many lies on 9/11 we were fed? It's incredible. And the same with Corona. We were fed so many lies. So we need a revolution there on the media level as well. So yeah, to sum it up, I think we have great potential as human beings, great potential. And in every interview, I try to tell every listener who cares and who tunes in to say never underestimate the potential of the human family. We're very strong. We're very strong, but we've been too obedient to governments for too long, and we've been too easily fooled by mainstream media for too long. And now it's time to put that aside and say, okay, we understand you fooled us. It's enough.
I was going to ask you for your final thoughts, but I mean, that was perfect. Great words of wisdom. And on a positive, upbeat note, because sometimes listeners complain that we look at things a bit too darkly here. And so if you've got any other thought, and then let us know where the best places to follow you, find your work, support you, and so forth.
Yeah, on a positive note, I really want to stress that we are in information revolution situation right now. And maybe I explain this for people who are young, who are like 20 years old. They don't realize it really because they were born into it. I'm now 50 years old. And when I was 25, I was a student in Amsterdam University. And then a pretty girl called Isabella from Cyprus came to me and said, Daniele, do you come with me on the internet? And I said, of course. What is that? Okay. That was in 1996. And then she replied, I don't know, but it seems interesting. Everybody's going. So that was in 1996. We didn't know what the internet is. And we went to a big room that was full of computers and they were online. So all the students, because students are always interested in new stuff. So we went there and there were hyperlinks. And when you took your mouse and you activated the hyperlink, and then the new picture would come. It took for ages, just for pictures. We're not talking videos. It took for ages. So after 15 minutes, we were bored because it was so slow. But that was the internet. And that was in 1996. So from a historical perspective, this is only very, very recent. And then the second thing, in 2007, a friend of mine showed me the first iPhone, which he had bought in New York. He was working with UBS, a Swiss bank, and he came back to Switzerland. And obviously, Apple sold the first iPhone in the US. And we were amazed. Wow, look at that, the first iPhone. And now we're 2023. And the situation we are in is, and that's really a positive note, we have access to so much information. If we want to hear details of this or that, we can search for it. And that's what I advise everybody to do. Define your own question and then search for the answer. Don't wait what the media feeds you every day, because they really keep you in a very limited spot. But if you follow your own questions and if you become creative, then we really have a lot of potential, because this information revolution is here. I mean, I'm now based in Switzerland. You, Jorge, are based in Mexico. We're having this communication here. Then you'll put it up on the internet and people can watch it for free. I know people are saying, well, that's normal, but it's not. I mean, historically, it has never been possible for a guy from Switzerland to talk to a guy in Mexico and then publish it for free, and people in Japan and in the US can watch it. It's not been the case in the 16th century, not in the 17th century, not in the 18th century, not in the 19th century, and actually not in the 20th century. This is only in the 21st century, and we're only 23 years into this new century. So I'm very positive that we use this information revolution for an evolution of consciousness. And if that's happening, and I see signs that this is happening, then people will really come into their full potential.
Yes, it's fun participating in this, what I call guerrilla information warfare, and we do have to stop and marvel at this and not take it for granted. Even air travel, every time I fly, I marvel at it, and a lot of people take it for granted. And so people can get your previous books in English. I know a lot are in German, but NATO Secret Armies on Gladio, and the new one from Skyhorse, USA Ruthless Empire, and then your website, danieleganser.ch. Any other place we can go or way to support you?
No, that's it. Basically, that the data is in that book. If you're interested, read the book. And unfortunately, most of my YouTube interviews or on my YouTube channel are in German. There's maybe a TED talk I did once in Budapest, which is also my YouTube channel. That one is in English. There's a few videos in English, but not many on my YouTube channel. Sorry, most of my communication is in German.
But
it's very good talking to you, and I thank you very much that you gave me the opportunity to present my book and talk about geopolitics.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list that goes out with each podcast and every weekend with a collection of news headlines. The newsletter and website are our last lines of defense. We're being censored and deplatformed. It's nearly impossible to find Geopolitics and Empire on the Google search engine. We've been blacklisted. YouTube frequently takes down our videos with strikes. Facebook restricts our page. Reddit and Twitter take down posts. And after the Associated Press mentioned Geopolitics and Empire in a 2021 article co-written with NATO, our Patreon account was terminated. Vimeo also terminated our Pro account. The best free way to help Geopolitics and Empire is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or elsewhere and subscribe to all of our media channels. You can find the video broadcast now on 5 platforms: Odyssey, Rockfin, Rumble, BitChute, and Brighteon. You can find the audio broadcast on the podcast ecosystem: SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, and so on. My current favorite social media channels are Twitter and Telegram, but you can also find us on Gab, MeWe, Minds, Float, VK, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Finally, Geopolitics and Empire is in dire need of funding to continue. You can leave a donation, purchase a consultation with the host, or become a member to receive additional benefits. We also produce a weekly broadcast called Dissident Thinker for members and Rockfin subscribers only. We will continue to fight the good fight come hell or high water. Thank you for listening.